They don't seem to have much, if any, reasoning power.
And how does this
You
spread?
guys are so full of shit. I've been saying the same
Everybody
damn thing
they
all
kill
day.
gets up.
Tell me something I don't know, asshole!
I've just been informed that we are going off the air
Want to hear something that really
and
sucks?
switching over to the emergency broadcasting system.
You guys know that chick at Dairy Queen?
I don't know when we'll be back on the
The
air.
fat one?
Yeah.
Until then, John, just a
She was coming over tonight. I would have tapped that shit for sure.
Bart, dude, everybody's dead, okay? Your mom's dead. Your brother's dead. That fat chick at Dairy Queen,
to say what a pleasure it's been to
dead.
report the news to you these past 26 years. God bless you.
Yeah,
And God bless America.
that sucks too.
Hell is overflowing, and Satan is sending his dead to us. Why? Because you have sex out of wedlock. You kill unborn children. You have man-on-man relations, same-sex marriage. How do you think your God will judge you? Well, friends, now we know. When there is no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth.
So is it okay? Did it continue? Oh, good. Okay, it's working now.
So I got off the phone last night. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So you can turn off the
Video.
video.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. My ugly mug.
So anyway, so I got off the phone last night with my former employer, just catching up, seeing how things in New York were. And I told him I miss New York a lot. And I mentioned a lot of the different things that I enjoyed doing in New York, even working in New York, you know, the hustle and bustle, meeting all these different people, knowing little nuances on who's doing what and who's making money and who's got, you know, these deals happening, so on and so forth. And he told me, he goes, all those things you've mentioned are gone. It's all gone. And it was kind of depressing and blackpilling, to say the least, when he said that you know, that New York in my mind and the way I've known it is not coming back. And I think that's the case for a lot of mega cities and urban centers across the United States and perhaps even the globe.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. I mean, we live in a new world, which is going to be substantially more homogenized than the other one in a way that's really not beneficial to anything. I mean, nothing will be the same. And I think people are really struggling to admit that. They just don't want to believe it. So they're grasping for like straws and holding on to things that really aren't helpful to them. And I mean, for people who live in the cities, it's got to be so much worse with all the regulations. I mean, I don't go into cities if I don't have to, but I think about it, and I think of a city without vitality is just a whole bunch of expenses and a whole bunch of problems. And, you know, the interactions from what I've always seen is what makes cities worthwhile. And now you have a situation where people are basically being engineered to not interact with each other in natural ways. And, you know, people haven't considered the ramifications of these decisions. So we'll see what happens. But
Well, everything's politicized. So even if you were to go out and meet the other, you know, within 5 to 10 minutes of a conversation with a stranger, you already know it's going to veer off into politics or the Fauci elixir one way or another. It's like as if you're not allowed to talk about anything other than coof and politics.
Well, you know, and I think this is one of the stories, right? That we are now dealing with a bifurcation of society. I mean, the truth of it is that the dividing line of our new future is going to be vax and anti-vax. And I say that because it really reflects the determination people have for how they're going to embrace the forcing of medical technology on them. And for the people who take it, it's all about safety and compliance, and they're going to attack other people as enemies of the state. And for the others, it's about sovereignty and survival. And the thing is, they're not really, they're talking at such opposite ends from each other that it's kind of hard to imagine a way in which the two reconcile. And the fact that the system is basically encouraging its own supporters to attack, demonize, and vilify those who are against it means that we're going to have two societies. So we're going to have a breakdown, but it's going to be sort of curious to see if there's enough people who stand against this, or they can do enough, I don't know, problem causing, we'll say it that way to be gentle, to actually allow there to be a counter option, or if we're just going to get dragged into this. And I'll say, I don't think, and I say this on my show all the time, I've accepted the idea that we are now living in voluntary exclusion. And I think when you look at the determination of the people who are following insanity, I mean, in theory, we would all love to get along. In practice, me as a Christian, I know it's a responsibility. On the other hand, I look at these people and question if they're still people. And once you reach that point, I don't know how you come back from that.
Well, what I've noticed is that there isn't much to discuss with someone that's already been vaccinated. For example, they've already taken it. There's no going back, right? It's like if you like, I'm being hyperbolic here, but let's say you committed murder. Well, you already committed a sin, right? So since you already got, one jab, what's to say you're not going to go along with booster shots? Now they're saying with the Johnson & Johnson one, which was one of the big selling points, was it was a one-time jab. Now they're saying that you got to get a second jab with the Johnson & Johnson. Well, wait a second. 6 months ago, you said there wasn't going to be a booster with the Johnson & Johnson one, and now you have to get a booster. So all those people that got the J&J one, are they going to be willing to get that second booster? Now they're talking about third boosters, and I know a lot of older people are all lining up, rolling up their sleeves, looking for a top up right now. And it's the data showing that more people are getting their third booster than people are getting their first shot, let us say.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reflection of the fact that the people who are on board with this agenda are fully on board because they're following the narrative, and it makes them feel good. They're part of a group. And it makes them feel exclusive and elite. And the people who are against this are pretty hard against it. I saw someone say today that the vaccine agenda is a bit like a subscription service. And
Yep.
The reality is that they've consented to having Big Pharma determine the efficacy of their immune system through genetic engineering. And given the track record of entities like that, it's likely that they are, whether they want to or not, they, for their survival, are going to have to rely on perpetual interventions. And, since they have to do it, they don't want to believe they made a mistake, right? Because the most basic thing that people experience, and that, you can find, I spent a life in politics, is that the hardest thing you'll ever convince people to do is convince themselves that they made a mistake and they need to change it. So for the people who have done these things, they're going to continue going forward. The narrative will be reinforced, and they're just going to be very aggressive about it. But I honestly believe, based upon the science of it, that this is really the opening act of the transhumanist transition. And I say that because you start to look at how certain materials are being incorporated into at least certain versions of the vaccines that are out there. And to me, it's as clear as day that where this eventually leads is to a sort of promise that we're going to give you everything you need for health, comfort, and awareness, but that you have to agree to give away all your sovereignty to a system. And we'll see the blockchain come forward and crypto be integrated into people, like those patents out there. And we'll see the social credit score being implemented, and any austerity or poverty that comes forward will be used in support of that. Like, for instance, the ships that they're doing everything they can to make sure they never dock. And
Right.
so we're seeing the culmination of all the sort of terrible social engineering efforts of the 20th century, all happening at the same time, with technology and advanced propaganda in support of them. And I wonder, for those of us who are holding out, what will be left for us. But hey, that's why I get on there and I talk theology, right? Because I don't think we can win the battle for this world as it is. I mean, we're just fighting the same machine that's been demonizing us all along. We're just now finding that the people who are standing at least the search for truth are a very small group who, when it actually comes down to it and there's consequence, they'll be willing to step and say, hey, I'll lose my job, or I'll lose whatever, or I'll lose my family and my friends. Because people, I mean, people are herd animals. They want to go along with it. And those who don't are going to be a small number. And the question is, you know, how do you herd cats? How do you get the people who think otherwise to kind of do things together? Because if we don't, then we're in big trouble. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I sort of have just accepted the best we can do for the time being is to kind of get away from it all. But it does make me sad to think how many people are just trusting the wrong people. And it's a curious thing why it is that governments can get away with lying indefinitely and are never held to account by most of the people. I mean, I don't expect, like, at least they should have to go through the pretense of giving us another option. But maybe people are exhausted of that too. Not sure.
You would think there would be some type of other option for people that are uncomfortable with getting jabbed with this mRNA vaccine. You know, hey, why can't I take the Sino one in China? It's from what I understand about it, and you know more about this than I do. It's like a traditional regular vaccine, right? It's like a dumbed down version of a virus, and you get injected. And there have been problems with that vaccine. I know a couple of people that took it back in Southeast Asia, and they had horrible side effects, just as the ones here in the U.S. But there seems to be, it's either in the United States, it's either this or nothing. And for the unvaccinated, like, you have to pay for your own test if your employer implements it. I mean, this is messed up. Like, how about you give us the test for free? Why can't it be subsidized by the taxpayer, just like how the vaccines are? I'm calling it vaccines. You already know what I'm talking about. You know, just make things easier for the listeners. But they're just trying to make it more uncomfortable for you. It's a form of soft power, coercion, you know, a silk glove with an iron fist, so to speak. And now I wanted to go and travel next year to travel internationally, and they just changed those rules around a week ago, where now you have to get a COVID test a day before your flight back to the U.S., where before, when I left in April, when I went to visit South America, it was 3 days. So it gave me 3 days. Okay, if let's just say I have a false positive, I can retake it a few hours later or the following day. Now I have to take it 1 day before a flight. So you're basically, you know, making it much harder for me to travel, let us say.
Sure, I mean, it's deliberately punitive, right? I mean, they admit it. You know, they had, what's her name, Jacinda, her and the New Zealand Prime Minister, talking about how they're going to have a two-class society, and you know, you see the Australians and the Israelis and the Italians and the Germans, Merkel's out there talking about this. They want to go and separate people, but you know, it's not about the medicine. I'll tell you, and it's not about health, and I'll tell you the simplest proof of it just from this week. You know, now you had the CDC and the FDA both say to approve to give it this to 5 to 11-year-olds. And as you'll remember, one of the things that was, you know, out there with the COVID thing was that, you know, kids were not getting sick. And kids have not been getting sick. But now all of a sudden, every kid's supposed to take this. They're not asking for parental consent. You're starting to see creations of child heart attack departments, you know, for these things to happen because there are problems. And so what that tells me is that when you have an agenda where they're out there and they're pushing an intervention which has no health benefit, which has major economic costs, causes social unrest, there must be something they're getting out of it that's so good for what their big agenda is that overrides all of this. And I've made the argument a couple times that I think what they're switching from is from a coercion economy to a command economy. You know, in the old days, you would have things run through big propaganda and big finance. And now we're seeing it run through big tech and big pharma, where basically they put the screen in front of you. I mean, you could live in a personalized internet where every story is being set up for where you're at. And with how much things are bifurcated and shadow banned, we're already there. Now you're having medicine being adopted in a way where synthetic biology is just around the corner. And people are like, oh, yeah, no, that's great. Just go ahead and reprogram me. I want to get along, you know? What can you do against that? And yet they're going after the kids. And you know, if people are ever going to be pissed off enough to do something, it ought to be now. You know, as bad as CRT is, how much worse is it to give a whole bunch of kids, a genetic treatment for a disease that's not a threat to them? And by the way, at the same time that it's been recognized by pretty much every entity that's sane that natural immunity is better because it's adaptive in a way that spike protein treatments aren't. There was a study, it was coming out of Sweden, I was reading just today, and it was saying that after 7 months after taking this, your vaccination status gives you negative health. And what it meant by that is that your response is so poorly calibrated to the problems you're likely to face that you are more likely to get sick. And this is just basic science that's out there. I mean, I'm not even going into the really weird, obscure stuff like the little hydras swimming around in this crap. Mm-hmm. So, people don't want to go there. And I said on my show, that I think it's the only thing that matters now. People want to get back into the old fights over old things. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I mean, I still believe what I believe was correct, years ago. But I sort of think it doesn't matter either. This is all being funneled into a fight against, this global regime that wants transhuman collectivism, and that the agenda we're seeing with the vaccines, in my mind, is all about that. And they don't really care about what happens beyond that, other than getting to a certain critical mass where they can't be opposed. And to be blunt, I think they've probably already reached it.
Well, it's like, was it going to turn into like Demolition Man, where me and you live underneath the ground and just terrorize people or some shit?
Hey, you know what? Edgar Friendly's my main man. I mean, I don't mind doing that. I honestly think it will probably, if they, well, let's use the example. Let's use what they're doing in what was it? In Italy, actually. They just passed with the Green Pass, where you can't shop in certain stores. Or I did a coverage of a story in Lithuania. They, it's not a country a lot of people talk about, but they made it where it's illegal to do any grocery shopping other than in small convenience stores. And that's at the discretion of the convenience store. And that the conditions they made were so onerous that people literally can only buy food at outdoor markets if they've chosen not to go on board with this agenda. So just imagine for a second, you're somewhere, you're living, you can't go shopping at the supermarket, you can't go shopping at the mini mart, they probably limit your bank account. They may even take it from you like they do in Australia. This is happening. You're non-compliant with having to check in and take pictures of yourself, so they take your money away from you. In America, that happens. We have so many guns. Everyone's going to be acting like Robin Hood. And I don't think we're so far from that. I could see that happening next year. And people say, oh, that's ridiculous. But we've already, I mean, the question is, where is the fire break? Where is the point where there's an institutional actor or a level of organization to stop this? The only thing that could stop it is mass walkouts by people or directed violence. So, and either of those solutions ultimately ends up in a fight. Whether, because you've already seen the government's willingness to brand what is it we saw, people who are going to school board meetings as domestic terrorists. So they're just looking for an excuse to pick a purge against the people. And the question is, will people have any ability to organize and push back, especially when every leader gets decapitated? And, you and I have been around dissident politics for a while. You know how it goes in that world. And you're just not going to be permitted to do that. So it's a problem. It's a big problem.
Now, digressing for a moment, this is one of the more interesting one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is I recently started reading a book that I bought 4 years ago, Strategic Relocating. It's a very popular book. I don't know if you ever heard of it. And it goes...
I am familiar.
It goes state by state on the pros and cons, what to expect, why would those locations be good to live in, why they'd be bad to live on. You decided to do a little homesteading. And I wanted to ask you, what's it like? Are there some things that things that you were not anticipating while homesteading? I know you're talking about boredom. I thought that was interesting, how boring it is, how much your day's tied up doing, kind of tasks that you wouldn't think would take so long to do. You went a long time without heat or hot water. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your little crash course in homesteading?
Yeah, no, it's funny you say that. We went 82 days without having access to electricity, or I should say we went 80 days without electricity, 82 days without water or I should say hot water. We did have water, but without hot water or heat. And it's I should be clear. We didn't plan for it to work out that way. We went and we got a property where we thought things would be quite simple, and we planned for things. We had resources to make things go, but we didn't have the labor we needed or the parts we needed to go ahead and get the electricity hooked up. And as it turned out, everything you needed stemmed from the electricity. So we basically did the equivalent of camping in our own house. If you want to think of it that way, squatting is probably the closest example, squatting with a generator. So here's what it is. You end up thinking a lot in terms of time allocation and trade-offs. Like, for instance, I had to pick in a given day if I was going to heat a meal or take a bath because I didn't have enough electricity to do both. And where you could do it maybe in a given day in 15 minutes, if I use a microwave at 1500 watts, or let's use a small amount, at 1000 watts, then that could use 10% of my daily electricity production, especially if I was running something off solar panels. So it really makes you appreciate that it's not always easy to get things. I mean, the one thing we don't understand is we have easy access to fuel. If that goes away for any reason, and it doesn't even have to be that, the grid gets taken down. Let's just say you can't get oil supplies easily, or you can't get gas supplies. How quick is it before, when we don't have electricity, the things that civilize us go away? Your stored food can go to crap. I mean, I had to put so much of our energy into keeping a freezer because it had food in it that we needed. Or when we didn't have, for the first 2 weeks, we didn't have access to a flush toilet. I mean, I tell you, planning for what sanitation items you're going to get rid of, because I hate to say this, but you can get piled up in your own shit pretty quickly if you're not thinking and planning for it. And the thing is, the things you would think to plan for, everyone imagines basically like, my tools are going to save me from the consequences of what's going to happen when things go badly. But when you start taking away the underlying infrastructure, access to fuel, access to power, access to electricity, if you don't have those things very well set up, what you find is you quickly revert to a degree of primitivism. And I don't want to say it's all bad, because on the one hand, you do learn a certain self-confidence. You learn the ability that you can survive things, and you learn how the value of different things are out there. But on the other hand, you really don't have a lot of time to do much more than just survive and endure. And my advice to people is, if things ever go bad, if it's finally happening, what will happen is you will be stunned how much time you have to invest just taking care of yourself. And I'm not even getting into if there was a mass scenario where you're going to have survival depend upon, looting, self-defense, and all those sort of issues. And the people who decide they're going to go play, vigilante. So what I guess I would say to people is that it's a really good thing to give yourself the experience and the trauma and shock, just so you can overcome it. But the exhaustion is real. The fatigue is overwhelming. And for myself and my wife, because I'll be really honest, and your chat will especially appreciate this, I really think when things fall apart, what's going to happen is, if there's 30 people in town, one guy with electricity and 29 without, there's going to be a harem with 28 women at that place.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because that's just, this is not a world where women are going to be very happy. But it's...
So you're saying they will not be able to go to Santorini, Greece, and eat avocado toast on a yacht?
Well, if someone comes offering them a ship there, they might follow it, but I don't know where they're going to end up. But I tell you what, it's no world for the way people are used to thinking of things. It's a very masculine world. It's a very physical world. It's a very demanding world. But yeah, I don't think they're going to be having ouzo out on the islands.
Well, I do, but it's really strange, because and it's unfortunate to say this, but you see young women in America who are completely, they're not in tune with reality whatsoever. I remember when the BLM protest broke out, whatever that was, June, July of 2020, all these women are trying to enjoy a Sunday brunch after a night of debauchery. And then just BLM protesters with, blowhorns screaming at them about their privilege, this, that, or the other. And they were just blown away by what was transpiring in front of them. Like, wow, they're really attacking us. And it goes to, it kind of tells me a lot of the psyche of not just American women, but there's a whole demographic that are not in tune with what's going on around them, not realizing that there's shortages. And I see that with baby boomers also. Baby boomers are demanding certain goods and services, and I'm trying to, politely tell them, hey, listen, I can't get you those things for at least a month or two, and even then, there's no guarantee that those things are going to get done, and I'm going to be able to get those products to you.
Well, it's interesting that you pick those two groups because there's a commonality between them. They're both sort of obsessed with social standing, right? But I think in some ways women are more legitimate than boomers on average. And of course, there are exceptions, like my wife and some theoretical boomer I've never actually met. But what I would say is with women, what my discovery has been over the course of my life is that women will follow whatever the dominant social narrative is where they see the most benefit because they know how to read that. So I think a lot of women's subscription to the social wokeism is very surface deep. And I say that because I'll give you an example. You will know, and I know some of the other listeners will know, I ran a show called Coronavirus Central. And I'm this big bad guy who represents everything you're not supposed to support. But when everyone was legitimately scared that this pandemic was an imminent threat, I can't tell you how many women who were, reaching out to me saying, help me, save me, tell me what I have to do. And then they started virtue signaling against me 2 months later when the dominant narrative shifted again. And they realized with the BLM marches that happened that summer that, this is where society was going. And my point isn't that they were right or wrong. My point is that they were following where the dominant social narrative went. And that's what they will do. So the minute that society breaks down, all the stupid wokeism goes away. And then you're back to nature. You're back to the war of all against all. And this is maybe the important part of the story as relates to that, where you need a ability to develop a countervailing social narrative that we haven't seen because we just let this happen because the media is such a monoglot entity. Mm-hmm. Now, with respect to the boomer issue, to me, the big thing about them is their inability to change their sort of basic belief, which is that, they go around, they're thinking they can do no wrong. They have no sort of greater awareness of their own achievements. And they just think in a sort of material enjoyment sense of the world unto death. And it's weird that they were programmed in such a way where they're not invested in the next generation at all. And I think that's really the point of divergence. And so those of us who follow them are kind of stuck picking up the pieces. You have the millennials who crave authority, the Zoomers whose attention span, they're trying to figure out what the purpose is, and Xers who never, like myself, who never really wanted to give a damn about anything, but who are watching and thinking and remembering things can't be this messed up. Right. And yet these people are just hanging on and just making sure that they suck every little bit of vitality out of the system, right? So that whatever follows is that much harder on the rest of us. And so we inherit their problems. And I suspect they'll want to be cared for when they're in the grave. And I think they'll be very unhappy. And it's a sad situation. But I mean, the end story of a boomer sitting in a nursing home with some third worlder watching them, thinking, how quickly will they pass away so I can get away to my lunch break?
Did you read Vox Day's blog about the Day of the Pillow?
Yes, I remember that.
Okay, that's what you kind of alluded to that, right?
I made a pillow talk joke once. I mean, and it's sad. I mean, generations should be invested in each other. And I guess, one of the things I've thought about a lot with that generation is they were the first generation to really be to experience the full court propagandization of imagery that came through TV and music. You look at some of the stuff Tavistock was doing in England, the people came off MK Ultra, and they engineered humanity in a way where people were not able to offer resistance. And I mean, I don't know. I wonder to what extent the individual has kind of faded away to this collective identity. And I think it started then. And I'm not excusing them in any way, shape, or form. I mean, the behavior in aggregate's been abysmal. I do know some good people of that generation, and I know a lot of bad people in every generation. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think for truth, to fight these things, you got to go back to basics. You go to families, you go to intergenerational support, you go to basic values. And we have been forbidden all of this sort of immune defense mechanisms against social subversion by various parasites for a very long time, to the point where now, when it really comes down to it in crisis mode, there is just no fabric left to hold together. And so, but it really makes you wonder what they're knitting, because you got all these disparate pieces that don't really fit well together. And unless you have something like an AI supermind controlling it all, I mean, this society will tear itself apart. It's not a question of if, it absolutely has to. There's nothing to hold it together. So something will have to be imposed upon it. And that's going to be the question of the 2020s, no matter how you want to phrase it. It's not really about ideologies, because politics is a lagging indicator and government's owned and bought anyways.
Right.
It's what the big financiers in combination with technology are going to do to re-engineer humanity. And they've already begun that with their biological experiment. I mean, and how far you're willing to go down the rabbit hole and what you believe about that is, demonstrative. But I mean, like me, I spend hours reading the stuff, and it's terrifying. I mean, we have people who think Skynet's a great idea. Let's make it look like Ready Player One. And, fun movies, but living those worlds is probably not going to be a great time for any of us.
What I find troubling throughout all this, especially when it comes to the divide between vaccinated and unvaccinated, is that the unvaccinated are a little bit more better at critical thinking, to say the least. So wouldn't a lot of these, businesses that employ more than 100 want to keep those type of people around? They wouldn't necessarily, a lot of them, again, I'm sure there's one group of business managers that love the thought of this group think where, oh great, we can just manipulate these people at our whim, because if they're this I don't call them stupid, but if they're that easy to fall for something like COVID, that's good for us, more money for us. They're not going to really argue about their wages or medical or their standards in a working environment. But at the same time, I'm sure there's another group of businessmen that are like, no, I kind of want to keep a few of these people because they may think outside the box. They may come up with some better ideas on how to adjust our business models, so on and so forth.
It's a sign of a society that's utterly obsessed with compliance, and there's no logical explanation by any economic terms for the decision that's being made with the unvaccinated. It just costs way too much of a market share, both at the macro and micro levels. So what I see it as is a sign of a compliance and coercion society, where this is just proof that a breakdown is being engineered. And I mean, yeah, if you were saying, you would say, hey, we want to reach these customers, or we want to keep these people, and smaller businesses are doing it. But by and large, larger businesses are not. And I presume they're not because the people at the highest levels have some understanding they'll be taken care of. And I mean, it's been a trend we've seen throughout the whole COVID scenario, where small businesses have been destroyed by mandates and by different regulations, as well as funding options. Big businesses have been allowed to endure, and we see the further centralization of power. I mean, this is neo-feudalism in a technological age. And, it's going to be very hard for serfs to get their power back. The only way it happened historically is by bloody insurrection. And if we surrender our freedoms of choice as blithely as we are now, the other part of it is, I'm not so sure how you get it back, because in the old days, the problem the elites had when they did things like this was they needed someone to be their enforcers. So next time you see one of those videos with the robot dogs from Boston Dynamics dancing around to Rolling Stone, you kind of have to ask, how do you stand against a system that now no longer has to rely on humanity in any way, shape, or form? And that's kind of the terrifying thought, that we could be going into a dark age to overdo anything that's ever come before. It's one of the reasons why, frankly, I've been willing to live in a homestead in the middle of nowhere, because I do believe, call me a dark prophet, whatever you want, but I think these things are coming on a very basic supposition that if humanity can explore technology, it does. If it can do something for advantage versus others, it does. And that once those things are available, they will be put into practice. as quickly as can be done where someone thinks it's to their advantage. And, people's inability to accept that such dystopian visions could be real does in no way precludes them from happening. And so I wish people could understand that, because to bring it back to the point you made rightly, which is we need to ask, why is it that every government and every party and every major business is on board with an agenda that only causes discord, unhappiness, and financial loss? And so you got to figure there's a pretty big upside that people are buying into. Either that, or we're all so sheepish it doesn't matter at all. And I don't know which is more disturbing, but personally, too many smart people are doing too many dumb things for me not to think that someone knows something about what the other side of this looks like.
Well, but here's the thing, right? And I was having this conversation about, the whole automation, the AI aspect of things, automation, I think is the terminology.
Automation.
Automation. Thank you. Sorry. You still need people to fix these robots. And let's say if they want to, a self scans at Walmarts, at supermarkets, those Boston General Dynamics, Boston Dynamics, little dog bots. People still need to fix those things. They still need to upgrade their software. You still need individuals to repair computers. Now, again, how many of those people that have been jabbed have the ability to make those repairs, and how many of the people that are unjabbed are, and some of them that have invented these technologies that have upgraded these technologies, are a lot of these corporations realizing the long-term ramifications of these things? And I feel as if a lot of this is going to be somewhat of a stillborn, and we're just going to descend into, again, this neo-feudal third world mystery meat. Identify with your hot pocket and favorite show on Netflix. Like I feel like there's a divergence between what they're trying to bring into reality versus reality at hand. Like great on paper, great in textbooks, not so great wheeling it out in reality. And you saw that during communism. You can see this in California, where I think California is a little bit of the model on which they're trying to bring about towards the rest of the United States. And America is really big. That's the other thing. I was telling you, I was in Pennsylvania last week, no masks. There was no one wearing masks as far as I can see. And then, you go to places like New Jersey or in parts of Virginia, and people are still masked up. So I would assume the places like Pennsylvania, it's a relatively blue state for the most part. It's 50-50. It's purple. But when I saw just, even Uber drivers not wearing masks, I'm like, okay, they're not even listening to their own corporate power, their own corporate structure, and who's paying them. So, I kind of got on a tangent there, but you get what I'm trying to say, is that what they're trying to bring about doesn't fit reality whatsoever.
Well, here's the thing, though. It's the question is the vision of reality. So I would look at it somewhat differently, and I'd say two things. Number one is that automation is increasingly advancing, thanks to AI, into areas of white collar logic. So just think of machines designing machines as an example, or that you have you'll have doctors, for instance, in the future be AI managed. And the thing is that the other part of it is that the presumption of necessity of people assumes that we are going to keep at this current level. And I think, honestly, global depopulation has been on the agenda for a very long time, because it's the ultimate control mechanism, because humans are unpredictable. And I think the people in charge are willing and believe enough in the existing technologies, and they believe, and this is maybe the important part that gets missed in this, they believe in the sort of transhumanist ethos that they're going to combine man with the machine. So it will be a managed transition where man becomes the machine. And maybe that's how you sort of square the circle you're talking about. So you could say, oh, machines are too dumb to figure it out. But if you take evil men and turn them into machines where they think they can make it indefinitely and they can go ahead and use certain things, at that point, they're willing to cut their losses, get escape velocity, and talk like, what's that guy? Yuval Noah Harari. if I remember his name right, where he says in Homo Deus that we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a divergent species. And I think that's how they see it. Now, you could say that, that's ridiculous and they won't achieve that. And that's a reasonable position to take. But the thing is, these are zealots who are acting with an absolute faith in the same way, in a lot of ways, that the pro-vaxxers are. And when you see that sort of zealotry, my read on history, as in my formal trainings in history, is that history is shaped by the combination of will and zealotry. It's faith applied to change the society. It's not people acting pragmatically. That's how people live day to day, but points of divergence come from people thinking that way. And these are the people who are putting their money where their mouth is. Like, you could look at some of these venture startups out of Silicon Valley, third strand DNA, ideas about how you bioengineer, re-engineer the brain with mechanical aspects. And they're trying to do this because what they want is a very simple story. They want to live in a world where they don't have to die. And a lot of people will sacrifice a lot to make that happen. And I think that's the story people don't understand. And I'm going to make a prediction. I don't think I've made this before, but I'll make it on your show, that it is going to be the promise of immortality that leads most people to their sort of demise. And I don't think we're far from seeing it, because the genetic sort of underpinnings that would be needed to accomplish that, the pieces are already there. It just hasn't been presented yet. But the question is, what will be the cost of that? Will it be eternal servitude? Because if you're trusting people to re-engineer you to that extent, what else is going to be the consequence that comes out of it? And I know this stuff sounds crazy science fiction, but remember, infrastructure is always a lagging indicator for what's scientifically possible. They could have done combustion engines many years beforehand, but you need to have gas stations, you need to have all these things to make it economically viable. So the technologies are there. It's just an economies of scale question. And since you see all the resources of the world coming on board with this COVID agenda, you have to ask, what does a system-sponsored solution to COVID look like? And if you start from that question, assuming these people are rational actors on at least that level, then you might begin to draw a sort of curious interpretation of where they're going with this.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm kind of lost as far, okay, so 10 years ago, and up until the last 2 years, again, when COVID happened, my idea was it was going to be this neoliberal, neo-feudalism, slow managed decline. And they're going to, brown America, the Democrats are going to wind up stealing everything, and they're just going to drive wages down, and things are just going to become more and more expensive. And COVID exasperated that tenfold, especially when the stock market started to rise. I think it was March in 2020, April 2020, you saw everything just go up. I don't, and there's another part of me that, listens to you as far as the homesteading and if there's going to be some type of economic collapse. But right now, the only thing that's really booming this whole system is the central banks. Now, part of me is like, you know what, they're probably just going to keep accelerating the decline. There's not going to be some type of black swan, and because a black swan will cause some type of wild card where you may have some type of region break off, some other parts of the U.S. decide to become autonomous from the federal government, something to that effect. But I don't think that's what's going to happen, because they want to keep managing the decline. So like a part of me is like, I still got to live my life. I still have to buy things, I prep accordingly, but don't over prep, know how to fix certain things, know your way around a solar panel, basic plumbing, electrical work. But at the same time, you still have to keep an eye on perhaps a black swan actually happening. And was COVID a black swan? I really don't know. It's really hard because, there's so much info and disinfo out there to really be able to tell whether COVID was manufactured or not. But I just don't see how they're going to. I'm sorry. The only thing I can see is that COVID was an accelerant to achieve their long-term goals, and there's not necessarily going to be some type of black swan where you're going to see zombie hordes and, you know, people in pickup trucks, you know, raiding houses and such. So I just want to hear what your take is on that. Two different ways of looking at this, because we're not going back to 2019, and 2019 was not a good year. I mean, we already had a bunch of problems in that year, and so many people are clinging on to thinking that we're going to get 2019 back. But looking at the long-term goal, which is the year's 2030, you will own nothing and be happy. And I take that as a serious indicator on what they're trying to bring about. And between 2022, which we're going to, you know, that's the year we're going to get into, up until 2030, I do see perhaps one form of economic collapse where they're going to have to reset the currency or do something drastically different to try to, again, enslave us long term without there being some type of massive revolution where millions will die or and starve to death.
Well, you know, trying to predict the future, of course, is a fool's errand, and we're all guessing, right? So let's put that out there. But I think it's dangerous to presume too much that the future is going to look like the past. I think we can kind of look at it, and we can kind of look at and the way I like to look at it is it's the relationships between people, right? And I think an interesting thing happened in the past 5 years that is kind of maybe the heart of the story from what you're talking about, because you talk about the role and the influence of central banks, and I certainly would agree with that. I mean, I put that in my first book, Someone Has to Say It, and, you know, I've been dealing with that forever. Actually, I had the honor of meeting G. Edward Griffin. You know, that's how long I've been following this stuff, which was an absolute pleasure. But what I was going to say is that I think currency, when you think about it today, is really a question of social accessibility. You know, and the central banks were terrified to death when Facebook wanted to go out there and make their own currency, the Libra,
Yeah.
and I think or Libra, and I think it's really interesting why they were, because the problem they saw was that if people are investing their time and energy into even an imaginative platform, like something that's just fake and phony in a lot of ways, or like you have, what's a good example? The OnlyFans phenomenon, you know, pick whatever you like. Money can exist in all sorts of different forms as coins that exist where people conduct transactions with each other. Finance has always been a degree of parasitism on economics, and economics is the study of people's behaviors. So people's behaviors divergent into these areas of fantasy and technology made it such that banks and dollars were actually starting to lose their influence. For instance, let's imagine, and this isn't too much of a stretch, UBI world where everyone gets $2,000 a month and they spend all their time online trying to earn money from one another in credits and games they play. And we've seen that world begin to evolve. And what I'm saying is, in a world like that, money isn't so much important as it is who has controls the flow of information and who can monetize and sell people. We've seen that Facebook and Google and Twitter and all these other platforms have evolved in ways where they're basically trying to sell you as a product. But what they have is a much more direct and meaningful access to you than the sort of pseudo barter system that is financial currency. And if you begin to understand that, then you understand the role that how technology's reshaping of lives has changed the whole economic model of what's out there. Because, you know, leaving aside just the basic finance, we all understand we're in a debt bubble, right? That's not going to be solved unless you have a lot of people die, or B, have a government default. You go a Weimar path where you have this just impossible to pay for. So understanding all that, I think they've been looking for a different solution. And that's why it's interesting. You have Facebook's metaverse coming out, you know, now that they're trying to transition everyone into this sort of imagined world. But in order to have people be in an imagined world, you need to make the real world so terrible that the stakeholders in it will say, I have to go forward with this. So you see the blockchain as an intermediate effect. You see the CDBCs competing with the private currencies. And it doesn't really matter, because the key infrastructure is you won't be able to buy things. It's the whole build back better thing that they're promising you. Take them at their word ideologically. They just want you to say you will have nothing and you will love it. So what they're promising you is emotion without substance. And how do you do that? You have to have a new world constructed in fantasy. What is wokeism if not that? But what it will eventually emerge as is that all the trends we've noticed over these years as dissidents and we've commented upon will prove irrelevant, because people will be so terrified of one another because of some sort of enforced tragedy, whether it be a worse pandemic, people getting sick, technological insertion through biological support, or just that they just want to check out. And so they'll build a new world where we will volunteer for slavery, in a sense, where we will give up our actual sovereignty in the world. This is what they want. And we'll live in some fantasy land where we're all theoretically happy. It's the same thing they've been doing, if you really want to think about it, from radio through television through the internet for 70, 80 years, 100 years if you want to go back. And so to me, that's where I think they're going to go with it. And what I think this part of the story people aren't ready for is that money means less now than it has at any point, I would say, in the past several hundred years. And the reason is there's so many ways, like you can, and none of you can, you really encourage to subsist. Like I was reading, there are 100 million NEETs in America now, that, people who don't work and they don't want to work. And by the way, I don't blame them. I mean, between the people who are getting kicked out for ethics of being unvaccinated, between the people who don't want to go work as an essential worker in a terrible crap job, at the same time that other people who have a lot of wealth are go forward, you have the billionaires controlling all the money. And, I know that's a left-wing critique and we're not supposed to go there, but they're right. I mean, it is a rigged system. And so with all of that, people are looking for an alternative to money. And the banks, the people who control the banks, really who are the power brokers, see this. And that's where you've seen this new synergy between the tech icons and the finance people. The finance people have gotten control of all the assets. They're the ones who are tanking the economy to continue that control. And they're doing all the sort of things they usually do, collateralization, but they're doing it in a way where they're encouraging this transition into something else. And that is your new oligarchy, in the same way England had its old money with the aristocracy and its new money with the financiers. In this case, the old money's the financiers and the new money's the technologists. And the synthesis between them is this idea that your worth will be judged by your informational merit within some system. And it will just be a question of how much interactivity you have. Now, will they forbid certain things? Yeah, they'll forbid it, or what they'll do is they'll quarantine it, right? It's actually a really good word, like they did with the whole dissident movement, like they did with MGTOW, the alt-right or any of these things, that they'll destroy that. But ultimately, they don't really have so much an objection. They just want to have everyone transitioned into a system like this, and then they can be harnessed towards some larger goal. Actually, more directly in a lot of ways. And you could think of benign visions of this and malign visions of it, but I think people aren't ready for this big of a shift. But my argument, I guess, is that it's already happened. And how you look at how much time we spend on technology. Like if you judge value by where they put their time, how much time do people put into playing with technology versus working as they did, let's say, 30 years ago?
Oh yeah.
And
Myself, I'm doing half the amount of work as I was doing 3 years ago. Absolutely.
so, I mean, if you judge by that standard, and I think time is actually the fairest standard because it's a direct reflection of what you actually care about. So, I think that's the difference. And do I have sort of like, can I imagine zombie sort of outcomes? Maybe. But I mean, I think only temporarily, in the sense that they want to have control. And I think at the end of it, they are probably going to offer to whoever survives after we have some terrible traumatic experience to bring us together in a false flag sort of vein, some truly utopian future that most people will go for because, frankly, it will sound better. The only thing is it will probably cost some fundamental element of your humanity. And that's why, I say sometimes this is the last war we ever face. And for me, as a Christian, I looked at it as a theological perspective that we are going to be offered something so compelling it will be hard to resist. That's where I think it goes, because at the end of the day, evil people want to be loved too.
That's true. Good point.
I mean, who knows? We're all guessing here, right? But I mean, a lot of people are going to be expendable along the way. And that's the harsh thing that no one wants to hear. But it is the absolute truth. And I think that if you're building a utopia, there's a lot of chattel that the globalists, the elites, whatever you want to call it, would be more than happy to get out of the way or have take care of one another. And at the end of this thing, who knows? It might be a bunch of crazy prophets and preppers dealing with a bunch of globalists looking across the screen at one another thinking we hate each other, and yet we're kind of glad certain people are gone. And if I wasn't a Christian, I would feel that way, to be honest with you, because let's assume for a second that the people going on board with this agenda are the ones who are going to be harmed from it. I mean, nobody sort of loves a yes man. It's like getting rid of every middle manager all at once.
Right. You know, you made a point about a month or a month and a half ago while you were doing the whole at peak homestead when you were really aggravated about your situation and how your chickens were dying. It kind of, you know, gave me a little bit of a flashback when I lived in rural Cambodia, where you're trapped between absolute boredom and then sheer terror. And that's exactly what had transpired in
Sure.
Cambodia from like basically since 1969 up until the early 90s, where a lot of people who survived the communist revolution of Pol Pot, they were living a very rural lifestyle, illiterate, you know, not really sure where they were geographically. They kind of just plopped in one location, tired of walking from the rice fields, you know, during Pol Pot, where he had these collective farms. Talking a little bit about my ex-girlfriend's mom, and you know, she was telling me a little bit about how she wound up where she was and what was it like, and a lot of things that you were equating in that live stream were similar to what she experienced, where you know, you would be farming, you'd have to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, roosters bothering you, giving you a headache, and then you'd call it a day by 6-7 o'clock, and then the next day there'd be some type of you know, raid by some marauders from the hamlet, 2 hamlets over or something like that. And you also said something where if something bad were to happen in the United States, so many people that do not have a faith in God will wind up committing suicide. And I actually do somewhat agree with that. Like a lot of these NEETs, I call them 13th graders. Like you don't have much to contribute. You really don't know anything outside of the video games that you've been playing. What are you going to do if there's no power for 3-4 weeks? And when Hurricane Sandy happened back in 2012, we went about 2 weeks without power. And by the second week, you can see people on edge. Like even the cops were like just super pissed with the situation. Everyone was kind of getting super tense to the point where if the power doesn't go back on in the next few days, you can expect some serious civil disobedience, perhaps even some deaths and riots.
Well, you know, it's a funny thing you mentioned that. I was actually in New York for Hurricane Sandy, but it was a weird thing at the time. I was a courier, and I get this job. I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, right? And they paid me to drive this package into New York, and I was just crazy enough to do it. So I remember the power outage that went down in Lower Manhattan and all the damage in New Jersey because I drove right through it.
Yeah.
And, you know, the thing about it is, civilization is fragile, and the thing people miss is cascading failures happen easily. You can have some unexpected action, or you can have a series of different things, you know, play into each other, what they call it, a negative feedback loop, and before long you have it all fall apart. And at this point, you look at people are by and large low agency, even people who we consider high agency. I mean, people who are really successful in life, right? They tend to be highly specialized in a certain field and not generally capable. I mean, I don't want to say
There's no Renaissance man. You're dealing with experts,
Precisely.
a super skilled individual that only knows this one thing and doesn't know anything else outside of that one little niche.
Absolutely. And the same thing, like I'll give you an example. My wife and I have been farming off and on for about 3 years now. And one of the things, the first year, I always joke, we spent $1,000 to make 50, you know, and that's it, the learned experience and the skills. And there's even in prepping communities, right? There's always this idea that I'm going to just step up and I'm going to do these things. But if you're not living the lifestyle, you can't do these things. And it's not because it's, you know, the people are bad or they lack knowledge, but there's a difference. It's like muscle memory. You have to really know how to do the things. And even if you can know how to do the things, you have to have the endurance to keep doing the things.
Right.
And if you're habituated to having things be very easy, it is very hard to change. Like I had a homesteading friend say to me, and then she gave the best advice. She said, it's harder to start from somewhere where you have some status and ability and you're switching to a homesteader life than to have absolutely nothing. Because at least if you've crashed, you're building from nothing. But if you're trying to transition from a life you were successful in to a life that's different, where you have to succeed in a totally different standard, you not only have the burden of the new thing you're learning, but you also have the stigma of the old thing that you will inevitably miss, where you were successful, at least in some meaningful way. And I think a lot of people are going to struggle with that. I think that if things got really bad in this country, where you had major transportation disruptions, or if they really try to push these mandates even just a little bit further, it's not going to be long before violence does result, and then you start having those cascade failures. And it may not even start in this country. This is a global tinderbox, and with the logistics chains being such as they are, everything's all interrelated to each other. I don't know. I mean, some people manage to think, the world's going to hold itself together. I wake up every day and I'm like, is today the day it finally falls apart? And, I think all of us understand that, and this is the argument for collapse, that there's no one who has the authority and the, should I say, the social capital, who's presenting a vision that actually sustainable, that's actually helpful. Everyone in charge is a grifter of one variety or another. And how much can you rob and plunder a system before it just collapses, if nothing else, from apathy, and then nature sweeps in there? So do I know what the black swan event is going to be? No, but I know that all the leadership we have at every level is incredibly incapable of stopping it. And I think they know that. And I think that's what the COVID agenda is ultimately about. Their idea to transition to a society they can control, and maybe of lower agency, to forestall the collapse of a system they created that inherently cannot hold together, which is the debt-based sort of slavery propaganda system we've had. Because we've reached the point, even China's reached the point, right, of the people, of the kids who grew up a whole generation who are utterly apolitical. They just do not care anymore. And the government wants to scream at them, you need to care about politics. And they realize it's BS. I mean, what do you do when you have such overwhelming apathy and lack of belief? You got to give people something new, because people just won't be motivated. There's no animus. And that's where we are. And if you take people like that, you say, okay, now go ahead and survive on your own. Most people are just going to say, peace out, And even if you want to look at it this way, I mean, cynically, if you look at it and you've really done the research about what these vaccinations, quote, vaccinations, genetic therapies do, people aren't doing the research. They're just going forward and checking out, saying, oh, I'll follow it, and if I die, I die. But that, what do you do about a civilization that has the death impulse? And that's what the West has. And it's had it for a long time. It's been engineered into us, and I don't think it can be stopped at this point. I think that there are pieces that could be made into something new and something original, and I think that's good. But I think that so many people who understand these things make the good effort to try to help people come out of it, and they lead them. But on the other hand, there's like, you can't save the system, and I wish, I actually want to smack people in the head for it. They just invest their energy into something that's doomed to fail. And
like the
what do you
election,
say?
like the election this past week. I can't believe how many people are cheering about what happened in Virginia. I'm like, what about the stolen election? You're cheering about, about some truck driver in New Jersey, and some shocker, you got a Republican in Virginia. I mean, the Democratic governor that Virginia had was an absolute tyrannical monster. Then you had what's going on in New York, where Cuomo just, resigns over a Me Too bullshit. We'll ignore about the elderly dying in the nursing homes. No. That's not where you're gonna get in trouble for. It's because a Me Too movement. And mind you, women fawn over Cuomo sexual, the love gov. He was a single guy. A lot of women were, sexualized him. I know many older women that found him to be very attractive, along with Chris Cuomo. So he leaves, and now you have an elected official who's talking about bringing people from the Philippines in because nurses don't want to get vaccinated. I mean, in my book, that's somewhat of a declaration of war, that you're really going to just bring foreigners in because a bunch of people aren't okay with what's happening, and you're an unelected official. Yet and still, we see so many people getting out there, vote, and cheering about a couple of governors winning. and some local politics, but you see the direction we're still going in. It's not changing anything. So a lot of people are still caught up in this left-right paradigm. I mean, I see Trump bumper stickers, 2024, make America great again, or something to that effect. I'm like, well, what's going on here?
Well, I mean, people aren't able to change. And, in the absence of a real solution, they're taking whatever's out there. And, they're taking token resistance in face of real one. But I mean, it's interesting you picked the New York governor situation because I've watched, what's her name, Kathy Hochul a couple times, or Hochul, however she says
Who
her name.
is she? I don't even know where she came
She's
from,
a
man.
nobody, but you know what's interesting about her? She described what they're supporting with such religious fervor. And take it from someone who does sermons on Sunday. It takes a preacher to know a preacher. She's out there literally selling this gospel of, we are going to build a beautiful new world. And in a lot of times, it's always the person that's behind the scenes, I mean, when we talk about the power brokers, like your people like your Kissingers, right, or your Soroses, it's never the guy. It's the guy behind the guy. And that's often the way it is. You put the pretty face like Cuomo up front to go ahead and keep the women happy, and to get the votes and to go ahead and advance the agenda. But this is what we are seeing, that there are a group of people who really do believe in this sort of like, I hate to say it, but it's the new world order's here, man.
Is it blackmail though?
Let's
take the guy who just won in New Jersey, the truck driver. Okay, he
Sure.
won. Is there like a group of people that pull him to the side and go, "Listen, buddy, that's not happening. Okay, we're gonna give you whatever it is you want, but if you go off script, the things that you love are just gonna disappear." Like, what is the mechanism behind it where you see so many politicians that say that they're going to do specific things and wind up doing the total opposite? Take Trump, for example. Like, what's the mechanism? Do you know anything about that? Because every time I ask someone about the kind of the mechanisms that drive modern day politics, they not really give me they just say it's money. It's just money. It's just money. Yeah, okay, we can default, and I think that's a bit of a cop out saying it's all about money. I don't personally think so. When you got Amazon headquarters looking like the Tower of Babel, I don't know if you've seen that yet. The new Amazon headquarters, it is literally the Tower of Babel. They're erecting a modern glass structure headquarters. The building, the architecture is the Tower of Babel. So when I show that to people, they're like, "Oh my God, what the hell is that?" You see how their assholes clench when I show them the pictures. I go, "No, that's real. That's Amazon's new headquarters in Virginia. Does it look like something you know of?" So let's get into that. What is it? What is the driver behind these people like the current governor, unelected, from New York?
Well, all right. So if you were asking my opinion, let's just talk about politics generally here rather than getting into the specifics for a second, because you asked a good question. Is it about money? And yes, it's about money, but what it's really about is about grooming and vanity. It's been my experience, and I was a campaign manager for plenty of years. I've worked at the state level for presidential campaigns before, that a lot of times the people who are elected are pre-selected. In a two-party system, it's not really that hard to pick two people ahead of time who are already owned. And the example I've sometimes used is a bit like a mafia, right? Where there are made men, where one of the first things you have to do is you go kill someone so that way they have the blackmail on you. So think of Epstein, for instance. People who have the sort of ambition to be public figures often have to do things that are distasteful, in my experience, from what I've seen, to go ahead and get to the point. So, and the reason it happens is so that basically their donors have insurance over them. The perception the general public has of how money works is that these rich people buy the politicians once they're in office by paying for their votes. That's half true. The reality is they bought the politicians before they even got there by allowing them to come into office, and they guaranteed that they would follow it and not have an overwhelming bout of conscience by having something to hold over them. And I think that in reality is how it happens at the much higher level. Now, are there examples? Do I think this truck driver who had $150 was, someone who went out there and who's owned? Not necessarily. And I do think sometimes there are, what should I say? accidents that happen where there are groundswells of support so large that you can't really hide them, and then you change them. Like the Tea Party is a good example. I was involved with that. The first thing they did was they got Americans with prosperity or for prosperity involved, the infamous Koch brothers, libertarians, which were open borders people who took a nationalist nativist movement and turned it into something for open borders, in the same way that when Trump got elected on building a wall and kicking people out, the next thing that ended up happening was he ended up putting a corporate tax cut in there. And the reason why is because people who have grassroots support are busy living day to day, and they don't build institutions. And institutional leaders will go to you and say, hey, I can deliver money and votes every cycle for you, or you can do what the people want and then wait till they turn on you 6 weeks from now. And the truth is, most politicians know that people are fickle and that they succumb to propaganda. And so while there are wave elections, it's more telling that the tides return to their normal schedule. And that's why politics works. And that's why the elites like democracy, because it gives the illusion of power to the people. But the reality is the pure permanent bureaucracy holds it. And the basic dynamic of warfare versus welfare in no point ever endangers the threat of the state and the wealth and power it conveys to the people who either are directly involved with it or connected by networks. And so that's kind of how I have observed politics over the years. And I hope that answers your question. I think it's a pragmatic answer, but if you want to get into certain detail, we certainly can.
No, it's no worries. I don't want to keep you up all night. I want to change gears here for a moment. Let's go what's happening internationally. All right. So I have my ex-girlfriend. She lives in Milan. She's lived there 2 years. She's not getting jabbed. She has a newborn, obviously totally not jabbed. I think just the regular bullshit like, scarlet fever or whatever, those type polio. Her husband, fiance, whatever, he's not getting jabbed. We're not getting a lot of information on the ground on what's happening out of these countries. Like I said, Italy, the mainstream media says everyone's got to get jabbed, but we already know Italy is a very corrupt country, very poor. I think you said recently that the southern European nations, their poverty is what's going to save them, because if you look at Spain, Italy, and Greece, they're definitely not down with the browning of their nations. Most certainly not Greece. I mean, they're really anti-immigrant, Italy and Spain to a lesser extent. But the Nordic countries and the Anglosphere, they seem to be going along with a lot of the jabs. And I think a lot of it has to do with their wealth and prosperity, especially with Germany, England, America, Australia, and Canada. We got a situation with China. Now, I don't know how much of that is all bark, no bite. You got still the situation in the Middle East. We saw what happened in Afghanistan, which you haven't really talked about so much. What do you see internationally? Are there countries that are fighting back from this new world order? A lot of people like to talk about Bolsonaro in Brazil, but I think yesterday he was giving a speech about climate change, how they're gonna reforest the Amazon, talking about sustainability. A lot of these, obviously, these soft talking points for the radical left and the environmentalists. A lot of people like to talk about Putin being based, but now Russia's going back into lockdown. And it's interesting because this is something that I noticed since COVID had happened, is that you'll see some countries open up and then other countries lock down. Other countries lock down, other countries open up. So Belgium is locking back down. China's locking back down. Now we have talk today from OSHA that they're now talking about businesses that have less than 100 employees mandating the vaccines, which is going to cause, I'd love to hear your talk on that and see where that might go. But sticking with the international politics, are there any outliers that are pushing back against these type of things?
No, and I think that's the key part of the story, that every country to a greater or lesser extent seems involved with this, including, something that people don't talk about too much, but there have been a number of questionable deaths in small African countries or where there have been displacements, like the guy in Tanzania was one. There's been a couple others.
Yeah.
No, I mean, nobody is allowed to be exempt from the agenda at the end. And I think that's the interesting story. In a normal situation, you would expect any issue really 5 to 10% of people to dissent, right? And that it doesn't happen. Like Bolsonaro has been good on that issue, but he has problems. Putin is good on certain issues, but when it comes to the vaccines, not great. Orban even has some issues. You know, a lot of people are very fond of Viktor Orban over in Hungary, and yet all of these people are going on board with it. And it makes you wonder, what is the compelling force that's sufficiently strong where all these countries are going along and they're playing with it? I mean, one could argue, I guess, cynically maybe that, you know, they're seeing it as self-interest that can be used in a way where, you know, they're all able to take greater power over their own populations through sort of totalitarian regimes, and that the health of the state, you know, is the suffering of the people. That's a reasonable supposition, but I don't see there as being a better place, and I don't see, you know, anywhere where those movements aren't being stigmatized almost instantly. And I think we just need to ask why it is that that's the case. And I mean, if you're not asking that question, we can draw different answers, and that's perfectly reasonable. But if you're not asking that question, I think you're just missing the whole issue. I mean, for any individual, I mean, and you know, I don't know. Now, as far as the OSHA thing goes, one thing that I've observed and that I think people should be really aware of is that OSHA does not have the manpower or the resources to enforce these sort of mandates unless the businesses are already by and large on board with them. And I think that's something people need to be really aware of. You're talking about a very small staff of people, and yet they're counting on, what is it? I guess they're going to say citizens turning other citizens in. I mean, businesses calling businesses out. I don't know what the mechanism is by which they hope to do this, you know, whether it's with the businesses over 100 or under 100. But I mean, it seems to me the government is dead set on doing whatever is required to weaponize large groups of the population against a smaller group and to turn those people into domestic radicals. And, you know, why they would seek to do that, I think is a question we need to ask.
Well, they're definitely poking at the you know, I guess the general Trump supporter, moderate right individual, where it seems that, well, since you're not fighting back or being violent, you must be okay with it. Well, since you're not fighting back or shooting or doing anything stupid, you must be okay with it. It's consent. Well, you're consenting, right? Okay, and they just keep going and going and going and going, and they're trying to provoke some type of violent reaction from, you know, basically regular people, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I'm watching TV shows from 2001, 2002, and I'm like, wow, it's like these are all the things that we're not allowed to talk about anymore. Like it was so normal and just, you know, just lucid conversations, just talking about, you know, history and politics, race, relations, ethnic groups, religion, totally okay. You know, it was a group of comedians, pretty diverse cast of comedians. The show's called Tough Crowd with Colin Quinn. I don't know if you remember it back in the day. It predates.
I remember the comedian, at least.
Yeah, he's great, Colin Quinn. And, you know, he had Patrice O'Neill, Jerry Seinfeld, George Carlin, Louis Black, and they're cracking jokes about, you know, World War II, and they're cracking jokes about Muslims. And it was fun. It was fun stuff. But, you know, if I were to take that conversation and try uploading onto YouTube, I would get my channel terminated. So I just find it strange that, you know, that's how far we've moved, that now something like that is considered radical.
You know, one thing that might be worth considering here is a possibility, and I've considered it. I don't know if it's right or not, but it's a thought, is that maybe they moved so far because they found there was nothing to stop them.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, it's like if you're involved with crypto or like sales or something, every now and then, if you reach a point where demand outstrips supply, you'll have prices go hyperbolic. Maybe society in some weird way has also gone hyperbolic, right? And what I mean by that is it's like there's no institutional actors left to oppose insanity. So seeing that, it just ran, and you know, every major institution has been weaponized against sanity, right? Like you know, federal law enforcement, selective enforcement. You know, you see someone like I don't know, if you take Kyle Rittenhouse, right? What's going on there?
Right.
That, you know, he's going to be persecuted unto death. But if you and I got dressed up in black garb and said we supported Antifa against, you know, the evil things, we could go out there and burn a city down, and we'd be like, they'd probably put a statue up in our honor. So it's like when you reach that level of insanity, but nothing's there to stop. And every time, like, it's even funny, like the FBI goes up and says Antifa's an ideology. I'm like, okay. At the same time that they'll go out there and they're literally persecuting, like James O'Keefe, for instance, just today, the Southern District of New York is coming after and intimidating their witnesses, doing like midnight raids on them.
Right.
It's like, it's, but no one can stop it. And you know, every time any of us tried to organize, and look, I've been a dissident long enough trying to organize, I can tell you, they decapitated people. I knew people in the liberty movement going back in the 80s and 90s, you know, like your Bo Gritz type people. I mean, I don't know if that's before your time, but it was like there were people who were ex-vets, people who saw how messed up Vietnam and other places were, and they wanted to do something, and the feds got involved. I mean, that's sort of the background to how Oklahoma City happened. You know, this whole thing, like what happened in Michigan, for instance, where, you know, the feds were provoking the insurrection, or, you know, January 6th. That's nothing new. That's been the same playbook for 30 years. But the right never did anything different. And so one side was allowed to push it in a different way. And now they control everything. They control the cultural ethos. And that's why I always say to people, you can't stop them. The only thing you can do is stop letting your own morality be subject to them, and stop using your own effort and labors in ways that are beneficial to them. Because we can't fight the war the way they fight the war, because we're not built like they are. And that's why, you know, what we have to do is let it collapse and come out the other side. And people don't want to hear that. They're like, well, I'm going to take care of my family. I'm going to do the right thing. But it's like saying you're the most conscientious, I don't know, officer at a concentration camp, you know?
Right.
I mean, it's like, do you really want to be the guy who won Officer of the Month 4 months in a row at some terrible facility? I mean, do you want to be the one who, you know, was, I would say, you know, the chief commissar at the Gulag? I mean, but that's really what we see people say, well, I won money, I did the system, and they're living. And I think a lot of people have been caught up in the mistake of living in a world where, you know, they've decided, okay, I'm just going to live in this quantitative world. And you know, the whole right does this. We want to measure everything by statistics and be very precise, because they were afraid to fight culture battles. And you know, culture battles are what really matters. I mean, look at Virginia, for instance. I mean, I don't think Youngkin's a good guy or anything. I don't expect much from him, but I will say this: CRT won him that race.
Mhm.
And so people were allowed to fight that over an escape valve, you know? And ultimately, so they got rid of one guy who was a Clintonista and literally brought in the guy who was the ex-CEO of the Carlyle Group, you know, the ones who had all the shady stuff around 9/11.
Yeah.
Nice to see the Republicans moving forward as fast as they ever do. I mean, I don't know. I've reached the point where I say it in my own writing that, you know, we're fighting a system. We're fighting a system that wants to turn mankind into tools. That's what I say in Come Out of Babylon. And all I can do is encourage people to consider that maybe the answers aren't out there to be found, you know, in the system. You got to look within, and you got to find people who come to a common understanding of truth, and you do it together. And that's all we have left right now. You know, you can't fix this. You can't make it better. All you can do is make yourself a better person by not participating in it. And what that means for different people will be different things. Obviously, that's not a problem. But what
Thanks
you
for the,
pick,
thanks
you
for
know,
the black pill on that.
well, look, this is the thing about my show, right? It's one of the most black pilling shows you'll ever hear, because I'm just not going to let you be intellectually lazy and say it's going to work out okay, because I don't see any evidence that it is. People's argument for why it's going to work out goes like this: well, you know, it's worked out to now and it hasn't gotten that bad. But if you think about it, in the last 2 years, it has gotten that bad, and it's getting worse every day, and there's no relief in sight. So the only white pill I can offer to people, and this is my take as a Christian, is that times are so bad, I think we're going to see the second coming. And I really genuinely believe that, because I think we're at the point where genetic engineering is such that humanity may unmake itself. And if people want to think I'm a crazy zealot, that's fine. I don't care. But I'm willing to fight for my beliefs to the death. And that's a lot more than other people who believe things are going to be okay, because not only is it intellectually lazy, but it's sort of morally obtuse, because what'll happen, you'll be like, if you think there's going to be a happy day tomorrow, you're just going to wait and wait and wait. And that's as bad as the crippling nostalgia we talk about. You can't allow false hope to keep you from opposing that evil which you see in front of you. And I do think we may not be that far from where people saying gather and they say, we're not just going to sit and wait, but we're going to actively resist this. And it's not that far, how should I say, historically, from what we are seeing now to where we're going to go, where that will probably happen for people. And once it does, you know, I don't know if you put the genie back in the box.
Well,
but I think that's where we are.
You said something that I had written for my article on the American Sun. We sacrifice today for a worse tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
By the way, your
solid.
articles there have been excellent. I've enjoyed them a lot.
Oh,
so
thank you.
People should definitely check them out. You know, I read them all the time.
I appreciate that. And before we wrap up the night, and this is something that I would love to get lost in the weeds on in another time, but I just want to hear your take on what's been going on in Australia and the fact that me and you can actually literally we cannot visit Canada. And I don't think people realize the magnitude on what that means is that American citizens cannot visit their neighboring country right now. Like that is when you try telling people that, yo, you can't visit Canada, you understand that, right? Like you cannot visit your neighboring country that speaks English. And in Australia, and I sent you that book. It's the first book written about what's happening in Australia. My buddy
Right.
John Stapleton, he's been on my show a couple of times, written fabulous books. He's written for The Guardian, and he writes for the Sydney Morning Herald. And he's just written the first book on what's been transpiring in Australia the past 2 years. What do you see? What's going on? And then we'll end the show on that note.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to stop. I've got some friends down there too, who are telling me, and there's just, it's a full totalitarian police state. I mean, sort of if I put on my conspiratorial mindset, I sort of feels like that place is being set up for a bigger fall for like beta testing for what they want to try to push forward, because the level of just recklessness by the government. I mean, I don't know how much people know about what's happening down there. They're seizing bank accounts. They're building quarantine camps in the middle of nowhere. I mean, this is really like, actually China has been publishing articles saying to Australia, don't you think you're going too far? And yet this is the world we live in. And the Australians feel like they have very little ability to offer resistance. Because,
I don't know what the supply chain situation is there. Seems that there's no starvation. I'm a little bit concerned about some of these camps that they're building. Let's say you have an unvaccinated person who, air quote, catches COVID. Well, he's got to go to these camps out in the outback, and the government can tell their family, oh, well, he died in the camp, with no proof or anything whatsoever. I can actually see something like that happening.
Sure. Well, they do that in this country, though. I mean, let's be honest. If you start to really study it, the people who die, in hospitals, as often as not, they're probably dying from remdesivir or shutting down their kidneys. I mean, but the thing that's nasty in Australia is what they can do is if you go to one of these camps and you say you won't take their test, and let's say you don't believe their PCR test, like Robert Malone, the guy who founded the PCR test, says that it's not meant to be used for this. Okay. So what happens is they just keep holding you, and then they charge you, and then they start taking your assets for holding you just because you're non-compliant. And I guess that's the thing. If you really want to look at COVID in the most cynical sense of it, you could just say it's all really about compliance. And every punishment, because a lot of these rules are demonstrably arbitrary, right? Like you'll have a place where they'll say you have to, if you're at a bar and you're dancing, you can take your mask off, but if you're sitting in a certain position, you have to have it on. And people, oddly enough, will ridiculously enforce it. And the one thing I think people miss is it's an attack on reality. And in the same way, like that famous, the Star Trek: The Next Generation episode, right? Where Picard sees like 4 lights and they make him say whatever number it has to be, that they want it to be. The point is not about what's true. It's to separate you and cause a psychic break from this idea of truth and to put you in a position of complete fantasy and compliance, which I think is directly concordant with everything we've talked about tonight. They're trying to break you as a logical being and just have you be a being who can support the government, that exists in fantasy, that follows the narrative, and is happy because you're not being persecuted. That's the new global citizen they want. It's sad. And Australia's getting the first shot at it. It's really sad.
How much of China you think is driving that ship right now? What's happening in Australia?
I don't know. I wonder it. At first I kind of thought the Chinese were heavily involved with this, but the West is kind of doing things where I almost feel like they're racing to outcompete them. And it's a strange thing, but you have to remember, most of human history is of suffering, bondage, and elites trying to suppress the people beneath them so that there's no meaningful opposition. So, China certainly has a global vision of it, but Australia seems to, at least on the surface, be standing up. I mean, they got that nuclear submarine deal to resist the Chinese because maybe they want a different seat at the table. So one thing to remember about the globalists, they might all agree to screw the people, but they don't trust one another because they all know they're liars. True. This is why evil, if good ever wins, it's because evil self-destructs. It's just one of those funny things. It's like the old tortoise and the hare story. The hare takes a nap once it's far enough ahead that the tortoise catches up. And so that's all we can do. We move along meekly, and we trust that when it all falls apart, if we keep ourselves separate, we might go ahead and inherit the earth. And, that's kind of the message I put out there. And I think a lot of people are going on board with that, that, in a world where nothing makes sense, maybe it's time to begin looking beyond the world. I have to forgive, my dishwasher's going off like crazy here. I haven't been able to use it in 3 months.
let me ask you something.
Yeah.
What's your any plans on writing any new material? Do you plan on making a blog? What are you doing as far as your channel goes going into 2022?
So, the funny thing is I sell at this point 3 times as many audiobooks as print books. People just don't have the attention span and time to read. And, it's a lament. Will I write a book if a story comes to me? Maybe. But at this point, I'm more curious of following the story in front of us. So from me, probably see more podcasting. I've been doing my YouTube channel pretty consistently. I think it's technically called Exit Strategy Channel, but it doesn't really matter.
You were on Odyssey for a while, and you had the I think it was called the Great War. You stopped posting
the last war. Yeah,
the last
war is the next. Well, the problem is I was doing really great in-depth episodes, but I have to stay interested in what I see. And I covered the topics I really wanted to cover, and then we end up with the move and all the problems related to that. So we've been doing these stream of consciousness chats, and what I find is my most supportive fans kind of like when I come on there and give them some combination of news, sort of stream of thoughts, consciousness stuff, and connecting the sort of pieces. And what I imagine my work will be in the coming months is I am trying to get a better understanding of the interface between biology and technology. I make a lot of claims that are challenging, and I'm trying to find the evidence to connect them in a way that's meaningful, because I'm not really interested in describing what's happening. I'm more interested in describing where things are going, because when you are the one envisioning what the future looks like, you are the one who actually shapes it. I'm not interested in describing the blind so much as I am putting out there a new vision of what has to be. And I say that because after years of fighting on politics and even culture warfare, you're fighting on someone else's ground, and you just don't win when you're that defensive. You have to get in front of it. And I really believe that when you look at what technology is now able to do, we are now fighting a war for the survival of our species against those people who want to modify us into some sort of hybrid. And I had thought, and I even hinted about this in the coming Civil War, that was 10, 20 years away. I think it's imminent. And I know that a lot of people think I'm ahead of the curve too much on this, but I've got to trust my own instincts and impulses. So expect to see me talk about that much more. And, I'll share the story as I see best fit. And hopefully we'll see it ahead of time. But I think that in the near future, what people are going to have to explain, and I genuinely believe it, is when people start getting sick, why are they doing it? And what's going to be the social response to it? Because I don't think the governments are going to back down. I do wonder very deeply if there is some external event that is driving the haste they have, as opposed to the theory we've kind of hashed out tonight, which says, well, they're doing it because they can. And if that is the case, what that externality might be, something crazy like, I don't
volcanoes.
know,
I know you've been talking about. Yeah, I know you've been talking about what's been going on in the Atlantic Ocean.
I like looking. You know what? I look for black swans because it's a big world, and there's a lot in the environment, and I just, on some level, my belief is always that a world that is this messed up is going to reveal itself in bigger ways as well as smaller ones. There's a certain, synchronicity there that I find quite probable. So that's probably what I'll do. And in terms of like writing books, I mean, I'm sort of blessed that I can write a book very quickly if I want to. The problem is most interesting books can't be published, or at least not published anywhere where they're commercially viable. So if an idea comes to me, I mean, I wouldn't mind writing sort of COVID things and New World Order things, but I'd get shut down in 5 seconds. And so the truth is, I'll probably work on my ministry. Dana and I share one, our ministry, I should say. That's the truth of it. We call it Sons of Dust because we look at it that way. We see the breath of God as animating us. And, the reason I focus on that is because I think if you're going to fight this war, we both live in the world and we live in a bigger environment. And I think that in the West, the mistake we make is we look at one method of analysis, and we need to look at all of them. And if you can start doing that, and you start allowing that, there can be forces beyond our easy understanding that we shouldn't neglect just because they're difficult, that some of the things can come into a very different construct, and you begin to see sort of the diabolical nature of what we're facing. And I do admit I let that sort of thing guide my vision, but I would put my sort of track record of spotting problems against anyone else. And, if it ends up being a little blackpilling, well, that's fine. I always tell my audience that I may not spot everything, but I will spot the big thing you need to be afraid of long before anyone else does. And I will help you be prepared. And from that, we build a community of survivors and of people who care about one another and who have common beliefs. And my hope in the dream world would be, honestly, that we find a bunch of people who want to live somewhere, be apart, and say, hey, we're going to live the way it was meant to be rather than the way it is. And because this world doesn't have much to offer us, I believe. And
Well, the
maybe
new
that's dismal.
Albion dream is still alive, my friend. Make no mistake.
Well, it is. The ideas we had were so good, but people just are not ready for them. And it's sad that so many people are so invested in their own subjugation. I just encourage everyone, come out of a system. If you know it's not going to have a good outcome for you, don't accept the bad outcome because you're afraid of what's getting hurt. You're going to get hurt either way, but at least you could have a good outcome if you're willing to have a little bit of courage.
True. Yeah, true that, man. Listen, I'll put your.
If a cripple like me can be out without electricity for 80 days, you got a good chance. Don't sell yourself short.
Well, I'm sure. Do you plan on going back to doing the homesteading? I mean, probably you're gonna enjoy having hot water for a little bit.
We have. I mean, we do it. We have chickens. We have 24 birds in our flock. We grow some of our own food. I can things like crazy. It's a lifestyle choice, but I'm going to enjoy the benefits of civilization while I can, and never become so reliant on them that I can't survive without them. That's the balance. And maybe that's a good place to end this message. It's not that there's a perfect solution. It's that balance in your own life gives you perspective to understand what's coming at you. Just because I worry about terrifying things doesn't mean I don't enjoy the day. When I get off the phone with you, I'll go up with my wife. We'll have a wonderful rest of the evening. And that's a good life. And you live each day. And that's all we can do at this point. Don't think there's a big solution, but enjoy the days because there are gifts. And you know what? Things are not going to get better, in my opinion, which means that what you can enjoy today, enjoy it because you may not have it tomorrow.
Well, God bless, Tom. Thank you so much. We'll do it again before the year is out. And I'll shoot you a message in the next few days, and I'll send you a link, and I'll put all your information in the show notes.
I appreciate that. Thank you for having me on, Lamprey. Always a pleasure to come talk to you and your audience. And hopefully before too long, we'll have a chance to have you come visit. The wife and I'd love to see you.
100%. Thanks so much. Enjoy your night and enjoy your weekend.
You too. God bless.
Take care. Bye-bye.